Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine, just for a second, a single book that, maybe more than any other, really laid the groundwork for how we think about wealth, about nations, the whole fabric of our economies. Today, we're taking a deep dive into one of history's most influential texts, chapter by chapter, really trying to pull out its most enduring ideas and some surprising ones, too. We're talking about a work that, even centuries later still shapes how we talk about everything from, say, global trade to just the price of bread.
It really is a monumental work, this inquiry, a true intellectual journey. And it gives you this unique way to see economic principles right from their foundational arguments. So many concepts we just take for granted today, ideas about free markets, the division of labor, even what the government should or shouldn't do in the economy, they really have their roots right here. Our mission today, I suppose, is to navigate this pretty intricate landscape, pinpointing not just what Adam Smith observed back in 18th century Britain, but why those observations still hit home, why they still inform how we understand prosperity now. We'll explore how these kind of bedrock ideas were revolutionary for their time, really challenging how people thought back then, and how they keep giving us these aha moments, deepening our grasp of the economic forces all around us.
Exactly. So if you've ever wondered about the hidden gears, that drive prosperity, or maybe felt a bit overwhelmed by just the sheer amount of economic chatter out there, this deep dive is, well, maybe a shortcut to getting informed, hopefully filled with moments that make you rethink things, and a bit of a story along the way, too. We're going to explore the core ideas shaping our world, starting right from the first principles. Let's begin this journey. We start where the author, Adam Smith, starts, right at the foundation. How do societies actually generate wealth? He kicks things off saying that a workman, even one from the lowest and poorest order, if he's industrious, can enjoy more of the necessaries and conveniencies of life than it is possible for any savage to acquire. Wow. That's quite a provocative opening for a book about national wealth, isn't it? It immediately makes you stop and think, what really creates prosperity?
Oh, absolutely. It's powerful and, intentionally provocative. It sets the whole tone. At the time, the dominant thinking, mercantilism, was all about piling up gold and silver. That was wealth. Smith just immediately shifts the focus. He grounds national wealth not in, like, static piles of gold, but in the productive powers of labor, in human effort, how efficient it is, how ingenious. He's basically saying, look around. A regular worker in a civilized society is actually better off materially than, say, a tribal leader living off the land. So right away, wealth isn't static stuff. It's dynamic human activity and how it's organized. It challenges the very definition of a rich nation. And the first book, he tells us, is all about explaining the causes of this improvement and the order according to which its produce is naturally distributed among different groups in society. Hashtag the power of division of labor.
Right. And to show these productive powers of labor, he uses this example that's just become legendary, the pin factory. He describes how one person working all alone might struggle to make even a handful of pins a day, maybe 20, he says, if they were really, really good at it. But if you divide the work into different steps, a number of branches, like one person draws the wire, another straightens it, a third cuts it, a fourth points it, a fifth grinds the top for the head, and so on, they could produce thousands. He actually observed a small factory where 10 people were churning out upwards of 48,000 pins in a single day. That's just an incredible, almost unbelievable leap in productivity from what seems like such a trifling little task. It's not just doing more, it's like exponentially more with the same people.
Precisely. And this simple, almost boring example reveals something profound, something that really underpins, modern industry and economics. Specialization, the division of labor, is a primary, absolutely crucial driver of productivity, and therefore national wealth. Smith points out three key things here. First, workers get way better at their one specific task. Increased dexterity, skill. That pinheader becomes incredibly fast. Second, it saves a ton of time that's normally wasted, switching between tasks, different tools, moving around the workshop. Imagine the faff if one person did everything. And third, and this is really crucial, it encourages the invention of machinery. Because when people focus intensely on one simple task, men are much more likely to discover easier and readier methods. The simplified, repetitive nature makes it easier for workers, or maybe someone watching, to think, hey, a machine could do that bit. This plugs right into the idea of human ingenuity as a key economic resource, something that gets unleashed and amplified by how work is structured.
He does note, though, that it's harder to apply this fully in farming because of seasons and the need for workers to do lots of different things. But the principle holds true wherever you can subdivide the work.
So it's not just working faster, it's actually changing how you work, potentially leading to new tech, That's a really big insight. Okay, but all this specialization, this amazing productivity is kind of useless if you can't swap what you make, right? Nobody needs 48,000 pins personally. So this leads to a really basic question. What makes this division of labor actually possible, practical? Smith argues that humans, unlike animals, almost always need the assistance of his brethren. And we get that help through exchange, driven by regard to his own interest, which, kind of surprisingly, leads to everyone benefiting. An early glimpse of that invisible hand idea, maybe?
That's the crucial next piece of the puzzle. Division of labor is powerful, yeah, but it automatically creates interdependence. You make pins, I make bread. We need each other. But then what happens when exchange gets, as he puts it, clogged and embarrassed? Smith paints this really vivid picture of how hard pure barter is. Imagine you've got an ox to trade, but you only need a little bit of salt. You can't just chop off a bit of the ox without losing value, right? And finding someone who happens to need exactly one ox and have the exact amount of salt you want right at the same time, that's incredibly unlikely. Economists call it the double coincidence of wants. It's a massive headache. This built-in difficulty, this embarrassment of barter, naturally leads societies towards using some kind of universal medium of exchange. So first, people gravitated towards stuff that was durable, generally wanted and easy to divide. Things like salt, shells, dried cod in Newfoundland, he mentions, but most often metals. But even metals had issues. How do you know the exact weight? Is it pure? So this leads to the invention of coined money, with public stamps for mints to guarantee the weight and purity. He makes this fascinating comparison, saying it's just like all niggers for cloth. Now, all niggers were these old English officials who checked and stamped cloth for quality and length.
Ah, okay, so like quality control for money.
Exactly. Coinage did the same thing. For the medium of exchange, it standardized it. He mentioned Servius Tullius in Rome using copper coins, and Edward VI in England, whose pound sterling originally meant a literal pound of silver. This move to standardize money just makes commerce so much easier, faster, more precise. It really unlocks the whole system of exchange and makes that widespread specialization truly practical. Without money, the huge productivity gains from dividing labor would just hit a wall.
Right, speaking of money, Smith then makes this really critical distinction. It makes you stop and think about how we define wealth, really. He separates nominal price from real price. He says money is their nominal price only. It's just the name. But labor alone is alone the ultimate and real standard by which the value of all commodities can at all times and places be estimated and compared. Verso. What does that actually mean for understanding wealth? It pushes us to look past just the dollar signs or pound signs to something deeper.
It's absolutely critical to his whole way of thinking. He explains that money's value, its actual purchasing power, jumps around all the time. Maybe new gold mines are found, making gold cheaper. Or governments might debase the currency, mixing in less valuable metals. So money is an unreliable measuring stick for true value over long periods or between different places. For Smith, the real unchanging measure of value isn't the price tag, but the amount of labor that something can command in return. The power of purchasing a certain command over all the labor. He gives this brilliant example to illustrate it. Rents which have been reserved in corn have preserved their value much better than those which have been reserved in money over centuries. Why?
Because the effort to grow corn stays roughly the same.
Exactly. The real value of corn, the human effort needed to produce it, is way more stable than the value of gold or silver, which can fluctuate wildly. So a landlord getting rent in corn knew, roughly, how much labor that corn represented, generation after generation. If they got paid in cash, that cash might buy less and less over time. So he urges us to look beyond the fluctuating money price to the underlying human effort. What did it cost in toil to make? What can it buy in terms of other people's toil? It's not just the selling price in a currency whose own value wobbles. It's a huge shift in perspective, getting down to a more fundamental economic reality.
Okay, so Smith gives us this way to look past money to the real cost in labor. But how does that abstract value then turn into the actual prices we see every day? And how does that money get split up among the people involved? He breaks down this real price of pretty much anything into three parts: revenue from labor as wages, revenue from the capital or stock used as profit, and revenue from land as rent. And he adds that landlords demand a rent even for its natural produce. This three-way split seems to simplify the whole economy into just three income streams.
Precisely. It's his economic trinity for a developed society. And it's key to understanding how wealth isn't just made, but how it gets distributed. The price of anything, he argues, has to cover these three parts to keep it being produced. If any one of them drops below its natural rate, production will eventually shrink or stop. So wages, that's straightforward. Payment for work, Profit, that's the return on the stock, the capital that a business owner invests, and rent payment for using land. His comments on rent are particularly sharp, maybe even a bit critical. He famously says, landlords, like all other men, love to reap where they never sowed. Ouch. Yeah. It implies rent isn't really a payment for anything the landlord actively did, like improving the land, but more just a charge based on land being scarce and what the farmer can scrape together to pay. It's a monopoly price for using the soil's natural fertility. It's income derived from what others produce, not directly from the landlord's own contribution, in many cases. He also subtly points out that a farmer's own income often mixes wages for his labor and profit on his stock, making it hard to untangle. But this basic breakdown wages, profit, rent, helps us see how the total value created gets divided among laborers, capitalists, and landowners, and highlights their different economic interests. #, market dynamics and wages.
Okay, so these natural rates of wages, profit, rent are kind of the baseline set by the general circumstances of the society. But we all know prices in the real world jump around. Smith talks about effectual demanders, people actually willing and able to pay the natural price, and how supply and demand push the market price above or below that natural level, the basic market forces. And then there are wages. They vary not just by how tough or dirty the job is, but also just by where you are. He gives that great example. Common labor in London could earn more than twice what it did in Edinburgh, partly because of, well, artificial reasons.
That's a crucial point, showing the gap between the theoretical natural rate and messy reality. Smith goes into detail about how market forces and social structures shape these payouts. The market price, he says, always tends to gravitate towards the natural price. But supply and demand swings, driven by those effectual demanders, cause constant fluctuations around it. What's really fascinating, though, is how sharp his eye is for power dynamics, especially with wages. He makes this observation, and it's pretty damning. We rarely hear of the combinations of masters, though frequently of those of workmen. But whoever imagines upon this account that masters rarely combine is as ignorant of the world as of the subject.
So he's saying employers conspire to keep wages down?
He's saying they're always and everywhere in a sort of tacit combination, not to raise the wages of labor. It's not necessarily secret meetings, but a shared understanding and interest among employers who are fewer and can coordinate more easily to resist wage increases. He's really pulling back the curtain on how power works quietly in the market. On the flip side, Smith sees high wages as a good thing, directly linked to a nation getting wealthier and growing its population. He argues to complain of it is to lament over the necessary cause and effect of the greatest public prosperity.
So high wages are a sign of success, not a problem.
For him, yes. They show the economy is productive enough to afford paying workers well. It's a symptom of health, not disease. He then goes on to list other things affecting wages, how hard it is to learn a trade, how steady the work is, how much trust is involved, the chances of actually succeeding in that line of work. He even notes some jobs, like doctors or lawyers, might seem underpaid purely financially, but get compensated in other ways: reputation, respect, or just liking the work itself. Separate economic policies.
So we've got market forces, power dynamics. But it's not just that. Smith argues the actual policy of Europe, government rules, create even bigger inequalities by messing with competition. He points his finger at things like exclusive privileges of corporations, guilds, basically, and long apprenticeships. He suggests these are often just ways to limit who can do what job. He even darkly hints that when businessmen get together, the conversation often ends in a conspiracy against the public. That's strong language. What did he think was going on in those meetings?
Yeah, that's a central part of his critique of the economic systems he saw. Smith saw very clearly how vested interests, often hiding behind excuses like maintaining quality or public good, could twist the market to their advantage. Those exclusive privileges of corporations were basically monopolies. Guilds or specific companies got sole rights to a trade in a town or even nationwide. This obviously choked off competition, let them charge higher prices, keep wages lower, all hitting the consumer and the wider economy. And if you connect this to the bigger picture, these rules, maybe sounding reasonable on the surface, often choked the very things that create wealth. Take apprenticeships. Years of unpaid or low-paid work might seem to guarantee skill, but Smith argued it could be learned less tediously and expensively, more directly. It just slowed people down from entering trades. He also slams the law of settlements in England. These were incredibly restrictive rules tying poor people to their home parish. They couldn't easily move somewhere else for a better job.
Really? So people were stuck?
Pretty much. It created artificial labor shortages in some places, surpluses in others. It stopped workers from going where they were most needed, messing up wages and efficiency. It really shows how attempts to control the economy, often pushed by powerful groups, can backfire badly for society as a whole. They act, as he says, contrary to the order of nature and of reason. It's a powerful warning about protective policies designed by special interests that usually end up hurting the public.
Okay, so we've seen how wealth is created and shared out. Now, in Book 2, we look at the nature, accumulation, and employment of stock. Smith reminds us that prices break down into wages, profit, and rent. We covered that. But then he digs deeper into how societies manage their resources, not just for today, but for tomorrow, for growth. This is where we get into the real engine room, right?
Yeah,
Capitalism.
exactly. Book 2 is all about capital. What is it? How does it grow? Where should it go? He starts by splitting stock, basically. All of a nation's accumulated resources into two main types. First, there's the stock for immediate consumption. Things like food, clothes, the house you live in. Stuff that provides value by being used up or changing hands. Second, and this is key for growth, there's fixed capital. This is machinery, tools, useful buildings like factories or shops, even, interestingly, the acquired and useful abilities of all the inhabitants' skills. These things generate income without changing hands or being used up right away. This difference is fundamental to understanding how economies are structured and how they grow long term. Fixed capital lets you produce more in the future. Circulating capital, on the other hand, like a farmer's seeds or the cattle he sells, needs constant replacement to keep things ticking over.
So, if stock is the body, money is the blood. Smith calls money a particular branch of the general stock. What really jumps out are his observations about banking's impact. He says the trade of the city of Glasgow doubled in about 15 years after banks showed up. And Scotland's overall trade more than quadrupled after the public banks in Edinburgh. That's just huge, an explosive effect from these new financial players.
It is truly striking, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it highlights just how transformative a good financial system can be. It begs the question, how do banks pull off such amazing growth? Smith explains they do it by taking that part of the capital of individuals which used to be employed in circulating it, basically idle gold and silver coins. Merchants had to keep locked up for payments and turning it into a productive capital. Think about it. Before banks, a merchant needed a big chunk of their working capital just sitting there as cash, totally unproductive, just to handle daily business. Banks, by introducing paper money banknotes and these things called cash accounts, let reliable traders operate with much less actual coin on hand.
So it freed up the gold and silver.
Exactly. It freed up huge amounts of real gold and silver that the banks could then lend out to other entrepreneurs, people who could use it for genuinely productive things. Hiring more workers, buying more materials, investing in better machines. It's like turning stagnant, dead capital into active, dynamic capital. But, and this is important, Smith isn't just blindly cheering for banks. He gives some pretty strong warnings about the dangers of being overstocked with paper money, especially if it's issued carelessly without enough backing. He talks about Scottish banks getting into real trouble by letting certain projectors, think speculators, or people with wild, overly ambitious plans keep drawing and redrawing bills of exchange, basically creating credit from nothing.
Like a house of cards.
Pretty much. He says these projectors artfully contrive to draw from those banks without their knowledge or deliberate consent, maybe even without the banks realizing for a while how much they'd actually advanced. This flood of paper money would constantly come back to the banks demanding gold and silver, risking their collapse. He also points out that just printing more paper money doesn't necessarily make a country richer or increase the total currency value. It often just pushes prices up. He notes food prices in Scotland weren't any cheaper despite more paper money floating around. Real wealth comes from productive power, not just more paper. So he draws this crucial line between finance that helps mobilize capital and reckless credit expansion that leads to instability.
Okay, now here's a concept that might really make people do a double take today, especially with our service-based economies. Smith's difference between productive and unproductive labor. He argues flat out that the labor of some of the most respectable orders in the society is, like that of menial servants, unproductive of any value. And his list includes the king, judges, army officers, clergy, lawyers, doctors, writers, actors, musicians, you name it. Why would he say that? We obviously value these jobs, see them as vital. It feels completely wrong somehow.
That's exactly where people get confused, and it's vital to understand his specific angle here, because it reveals how Smith viewed economic growth. He's not saying teachers or doctors or judges are worthless or unnecessary, not at all. His definition of productive labor is very, very specific, tied to the manufacturing economy he was seeing emerge. For him, productive labor is work that fixes or realizes itself in some particular subject or vendible commodity. meaning it creates a tangible physical good, something you can store, sell, trade, and add to the nation's capital stock. A carpenter makes a chair, a farmer grows wheat, a factory worker makes pins. These are lasting, sellable things that build up capital. The services of the unproductive, however valuable, generally perish in the very instant of their performance. They don't leave behind a tangible product to accumulate. A servant cleans, a soldier defends, a singer performs, the service is consumed immediately.
So it's about whether it adds to the pile of stuff.
In a way, yes. Whether it adds to the stock of goods that can be saved and reinvested to create more wealth later, the implication is pretty stark. As a smaller or greater proportion of the annual produce is employed in maintaining unproductive hands, the more, or the less, will remain for the productive, and the next year's produce will be greater or smaller accordingly. It forces you to think about where resources ultimately go. Do they create something that expands future productive capacity? Or are they consumed right away? It was a radical idea then, challenging the view that just spending money, especially on luxuries or services, equaled wealth. Smith was focused laser-like on how capital accumulates as the driver of long-term prosperity. Okay, so if productive labor creates the goods, how does a nation actually grow its wealth, its capital stock, over time? Smith says quite emphatically, parsimony and not industry is the immediate cause of the increase of capital. That feels really backward to our modern work hard, play hard culture, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's just working hard, not enough. It absolutely challenges common thinking, and it's another of Smith's really deep insights. Yes, industry is needed to produce things, but industry alone just creates output. Parsimony, which is basically saving, is what ensures that output isn't all consumed immediately. Instead, it gets turned into capital. Capital that can then be used to hire an additional number of productive hands or buy better machines. Someone who spends everything diminishes capital. Someone who saves and invests increases it. It's the act of not consuming now and instead putting resources towards future production that builds wealth. He points to England's growth, saying, "The annual produce of the land and labor of England is certainly much greater than it was a little more than a century ago, silently and gradually accumulated by the private frugality and good conduct of individuals." It's this universal, continual, and uninterrupted effort of individuals to better their own condition, when protected by law and liberty, that has maintained the progress of England towards opulence. It highlights this powerful, almost invisible force. Individual saving and smart investment are the bedrock of national capital growth.
So it's millions of small acts of saving adding up.
Exactly. He's saying countless small acts of thrift and sensible investment, spread across a whole nation, do far more for lasting prosperity than just sheer effort alone. It's not just about earning more. It's about saving and productively investing some of what you earn. That applies to individuals and the nation as a whole.
Right, so once capital is saved through parsimony, the next big question is, where does it go? How is it used? Smith looks at how capital gets spread around into agriculture, in manufacturers, or in some particular branch of the wholesale or retail trade, unquote. He says pretty clearly that the consideration of his own private profit is the sole motive which determines the owner of any capital. Pure self-interest driving investment decisions. Makes sense. But then he makes this odd observation. He says that in Europe at the time, the profits of agriculture seem to have no superiority over those of other employments. He even says people would rather put their money into the most distant carrying trades of Asia and America than in the improvement and cultivation of the most fertile fields in their own neighborhood. Why would that be? If farming is so fundamental, why wouldn't capital flow there first?
This really opens up the question of the natural versus the artificial flow of capital, and it tees up his later attacks on government policy. While yes, private profit is the main driver for the individual investor, they want the best return, Smith sees that government rules, history, even social biases can seriously distort where that capital actually goes. He suggests that natural progress would see agriculture come first. It provides basic food and materials. But in Europe, he saw this unnatural progress where trade and manufacturing often got prioritized or subsidized, pulling capital away from farming. So why choose risky, far-flung trading ventures over improving local land? Smith points to a few things. One, those distant trades, though risky, sometimes offered much higher, if less steady, profits, tempting speculative money. Two, the leftover structures of feudalism often made owning or improving land less appealing or profitable than business.
Like legal hassles.
Yeah, land might still have complicated ownership rights, weird taxes, or just unclear property rules that put investors off. This really sets the stage for Book 3, where he dives into the different progress of opulence in different nations, showing how these historical choices and policies shape development, often slowing down stable, long-term growth in agriculture.
Okay, so after laying out the building blocks, how wealth is made, traded, saved up, Smith then turns to history in Book 3. He explores the different progress of opulence in different nations. He starts by sketching out this natural progress where the countryside feeds the town and the town provides a market and makes stuff for the country. It sounds so logical, right? Organic, balanced growth. One supports the other. But, he quickly says, history often took a very different route.
Precisely. The natural way, as Smith sees it, is farming develops first. The surplus food lets some people do other things, so towns pop up. Towns then become markets for farm goods and centers for making things. It's a nice, neat cycle. However, Smith shows how this order, being contrary to the natural course of things, is necessarily both slow and uncertain in Europe's actual history. Instead, he sees an inversion. The commerce and manufactures of cities, instead of being the effect, have been a cause and occasion of the improvement and cultivation of the country.
So the cities pulled the countryside along rather than the other way around.
Exactly. This reversal fundamentally shaped how Europe developed, leading to a different, maybe more complicated and less stable path to wealth, where urban growth drove rural change.
He paints this really vivid picture of the feudal system. You have these big landlords consuming all their surplus produce through rustic hospitality, feeding a multitude of retainers and dependents. These hangers-on had zero incentive to be productive or move up. It sounds like a really stagnant, top-down society. But then things start shifting. He mentions long leases appearing and the expensive vanity of the landlord who starts wanting fancy goods instead of just feeding retainers. How did the cities and what they offered help trigger this massive change away from that old feudal setup?
Oh, the rise of cities was absolutely central to breaking down that feudal order. Picture those feudal lords, right? Their status measured by how many people they could feed from their lands, living in this state of rustic hospitality. It looked like power, but Smith saw it as totally stagnant economics, just consuming capital in a way that led nowhere productive, just more mouths to feed, almost laughably inefficient. Cities offered something completely different. They were dynamic markets for farm goods, and crucially, places where industry, aiming for more than just basic survival, could actually thrive. The burghers, the city dwellers, gradually won their freedom from the total control of local lords. They formed these commonalities or corporations, basically, self-governing groups. They had their own magistrates, even their own militias, sometimes paying rent directly to the king just to be free from annoying local officials.
So they bought their independence.
In a way, yes. And this urban freedom and the wealth created there, often by merchants, started to ripple out into the countryside. Landlords got tempted by the new luxury goods. Cities offered fancy clothes, jewels, imported wine fueled by their expensive vanity. So they started dismissing their retainers because they needed cash, not just people to feed. And they began offering longer leases to farmers in exchange for that cash. The cash bought the luxuries, and the long leases gave farmers a real reason to invest and improve the land, because they'd actually benefit from it for longer. This eventually led to the slow abolition of villenage, that system where peasants were basically tied to the land and the lord. As these people gained freedom through leases and became more independent farmers, you can see how individual economic drives, plus legal changes, especially the freedom and security offered by cities, just dismantle the old power structures. It's amazing how the desire for luxuries, often seen as trivial, could accidentally drive such huge social shifts. The precariousness of commercial capital.
That's fascinating how city life basically rewired the countryside. But Smith then adds this interesting caveat about wealth made from trade and manufacturing. He says it's always a very precarious and uncertain possession till some part of it has been secured and realized in the cultivation and improvement of land. Oh, that's a stark reminder, isn't it? Even with booming trade, land is still seen as the bedrock, the most stable form of wealth. Why did he see commercial wealth as so shaky compared to land?
It really highlights Smith's long-term view of national wealth, the need for a stable, tangible foundation. While trade manufacturing can create wealth quickly, they're also much more vulnerable to external shocks. Commercial capital is fluid, easily moved. It relies heavily on open trade routes, peaceful political relations, predictable markets. It's much more exposed to wars disrupting trade, changes in politics, even shifts in fashion or consumer demand. A merchant's fortune might be tied up in ships halfway across the world or goods sitting in a warehouse somewhere, all facing risks. Putting that capital into land, however, by buying it and improving it, creates something more durable, less mobile, and generally more secure. Land doesn't sail away or go out of fashion. It remains, pretty much regardless of market swings or political chaos. Investing in making it more productive creates lasting value that's less prone to sudden shocks.
Like the Spanish in America focusing just on gold.
Exactly his example. Their first inquiry was always about gold and silver, not the potential of the land itself. Smith saw this as a basic misunderstanding of true wealth. They extracted fleeting metals instead of building a lasting, productive economy based on agriculture. So this observation really stresses the need for a diverse economy where commercial wealth eventually flows back into improving the domestic agricultural base. It grounds prosperity in something tangible and resilient. It's a warning against purely speculative or far-flung ventures and a call to anchor national wealth in the nation's own productive land.
Okay, now we hit book 4, where Smith really takes aim at the systems of political economy, the big ideas and often big mistakes governments make when they try to manage wealth. He goes straight after the popular notions that drove nations to obsessively accumulate gold and silver in their respective countries. This sounds exactly like what we call mercantilism, right? This dominant way of thinking in Europe for ages.
Absolutely. This book is just a powerful point-by-point takedown of the whole mercantile system, which, as you say, wrongly measured a nation's wealth by how much gold and silver it had stashed away. The core belief was that foreign trade was mainly good because it brought in precious metals. And they had this idea that a nation cannot send much money abroad unless it has a good deal at home, mostly thinking about funding foreign wars. Smith just demolishes this. He shows that this thinking, seeing wealth as a zero-sum game where one country wins only if another loses, leads to policies designed to beggar all their neighbors. And this, he argues, turns trade, which should be a bond of union and friendship, into the most fertile source of discord and animosity. He insists the real wealth is a country's actual consumable goods and its ability to produce them, not just the coins used to trade them. He uses this great analogy of household pots and pans. You wouldn't hoard more than you need, right? And if you got more food, you get more pots as needed, not hoard pots hoping for food. Same for a nation and its money supply, he argued. Hashtag the folly of protectionism and monopolies.
And this obsession with gold led to all sorts of policies. Duties on imports, prohibitions banning certain goods, bounties or subsidies for exports, advantageous treaties of commerce. Smith is especially harsh on the interested sophistry of merchants and manufacturers. He says they basically confounded the common sense of mankind by lobbying for rules that gave them a monopoly of the home market. He calls it thinking like the most underling tradesman, but somehow elevated to become political maxims for whole empires. It really shows how private lobbying can distort policy, making it seem like it's for the national good when it's not.
That image is striking, isn't it? Turning trade from friendship to animosity. And Smith's faith in individual judgment is just immense here. He argues that no politician, no matter how smart, can possibly direct private people in what manner they ought to employ their capitals better than the people themselves. They know their local situation, their opportunities far better. He saw all these protectionist policies import taxes, bans, export subsidies as just artificial distortions. They twisted the natural flow of capital away from where it would be most productive, purely to benefit specific domestic groups by shielding them from competition. He uses the famous Act of Navigation as a key example. These were English laws, starting in the 1600s, meant to restrict foreign ships in trade with England and its colonies, mainly to undercut the Dutch shipping industry.
Did he think it worked, at least for defense?
He concedes it might have offered some strategic defense advantage against the Dutch Navy, which was powerful. But, he says bluntly, it placed a very heavy burden on Britain's overall economy. It artificially limited trade routes and choices, forcing British merchants into using potentially less efficient or more costly British ships. Regulations like that, he observes, not only introduce very dangerous disorders into the body politic, but disorders which it is often difficult to remedy without occasioning still greater disorders. He actually argues for making changes gradually, not suddenly ripping away protections, because people and capital get invested based on existing rules. You have to manage the transition carefully. But fundamentally, he's deeply skeptical of anyone claiming they can manage the economy better than the combined wisdom of individuals acting in their own interest.
Okay, building on monopolies, Smith then zooms in on the exclusive trade of the mother countries with their colonies. He calls this another kind of monopoly that actually tends to diminish the total quantity of produce to do. And then he makes an even bolder claim that the high profits of British stock that came from this colonial monopoly, not just high wages, actually made British goods more expensive and harder to sell in other foreign markets. That's a huge accusation that the prized colonial system could actually be hurting Britain's overall competitiveness.
It's a truly radical and counterintuitive argument, completely flipping the conventional wisdom of the time, which saw colonies as vital national assets. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Smith argued the colonial monopoly, while definitely benefiting a single order of men, the merchants directly involved, was, in many different ways, hurtful to the general interest of the country. End quote. How? Well, it warped the natural flow of capital. Instead of money going into more direct, faster returning trades with Europe, which might benefit a wider range of industries, the monopoly sucked capital into the distant, slower colonial trade. The profits there were only high because competition was banned. So capital got tied up longer in this roundabout trade. Because profits were artificially high in the colonial trade, British merchants had less reason to bother competing hard in other, more open markets. The result, British goods became more expensive overall because the whole capital structure was skewed by this monopoly.
So it made them lazy, in a way.
You could say that. Less competitive. He even points out that other countries, like the Dutch with their Cape of Good Hope trading post, managed things better because they didn't impose the same tight monopolies. They treated it more like a useful stopover, not an exclusive market. His critique is just this powerful case for free trade, arguing against the self-serving interests that drive protectionist policies. He even notes how the East India Company's own employees set up monopolies for their private trade, alongside the company's official one, enriching themselves even further at everyone else's expense. The monopoly, he concludes, ultimately raised the price of British goods abroad, making them less competitive globally. Protectionism ends up harming the protected. Hashtag here the system of natural liberty.
Right. So after picking apart all these systems, either of preference or of restraint, all the ways governments try to push or pull the economy in, Smith arrives at this grand conclusion for Book 4. It feels like the heart of his whole philosophy. All systems, being thus completely taken away, the obvious and simple system of natural liberty establishes itself of its own accord. Every man, as long as he does not violate the laws of justice, is left perfectly free to pursue his own interest in his own way. Wow. That's such a powerful vision, a complete contrast to all the complex, often self-defeating government meddling he just described. It sounds almost revolutionary.
It really is the essence of his economic thinking. And this is where the idea of the visible hand, although he doesn't actually use that exact phrase right here, is so clearly implied and comes fully into focus. It's the belief that when individuals are free to chase their own self-interest, but within a fair legal system, one that ensures competition, enforces contracts, protects property, the whole society benefits, often unintentionally. Private ambition, channeled correctly, leads to public good. Capital naturally finds its most productive use, resources get allocated efficiently, innovation happens, all without some government planner trying, usually clumsily, to direct it all. He criticizes other systems too, like those that favored agriculture over everything else and restricted manufacturing or foreign trade. He argues they also retard instead of accelerating the progress of the society towards real wealth and greatness. So this conclusion is just this ringing call for minimal government intervention in the economy. He argues interference usually creates more problems than it solves. He envisions a system where the government has just 3 core jobs: defense, justice, and providing certain essential public works that private enterprise wouldn't tackle. This vision of natural liberty is arguably one of Smith's most powerful and lasting legacies. It's the foundational argument for what we now call free market economics.
Okay, finally, Book V. We arrive at the revenue of the sovereign or commonwealth. After exploring how individuals and nations create wealth, Smith tackles the practical stuff. How should the government pay for the essential things it needs to do? This book, he says, covers the necessary government expenses, where the money should come from, revenue sources, and the big one, the impact of national debt. It feels like the real-world application of all the theory we've just discussed, shifting from wealth creation to managing the public purse responsibly.
Exactly. This final book shifts the focus dramatically. It's all about the state's role and responsibilities. Smith starts by outlining what he sees as the 3 different duties of the sovereign, the core functions of government. First, defending the society from external threats. Second, administering justice internally. And third, erecting and maintaining certain public works and certain public institutions that individuals wouldn't find profitable, but which benefit everyone. He makes this interesting observation that the cost of defense, especially, grows gradually more and more expensive as the society advances in civilization. That definitely rings true today, doesn't it? With complex military tech and professional armies costing a fortune.
He notes that way back in simple societies, defense might cost the government nothing. Everyone was a part-time warrior. But as society develops, you need a professional army, maintained first in time of war and afterwards even in time of peace. He even mentions the invention of gunpowder as this mere accident that suddenly made warfare vastly more expensive, rendering old castles useless and demanding totally new approaches to military funding. For justice, he argues public services work best when the reward comes only in consequence of their being performed, almost like pay for performance today. But he warns sharply that when the judicial power is mixed with the executive power, it is scarce possible that justice should not frequently be sacrificed to politics. A huge argument for separating powers.
These points really highlight how government costs evolve. Complexity demands more state spending, like shifting from citizen militias to pricey professional armies. He then gets into that third duty, public works. Things like roads, bridges, canals. He suggests their upkeep should ideally be paid for by user fees, like tolls, and managed by independent commissioners or trustees, not directly by the government itself. Why? He worried about abuses and the natural inefficiency of direct state control.
So keep government out of the day-to-day running.
Pretty much. That emphasis on incentives and independent oversight is still relevant for managing public services today. And then, remarkably, Smith argues for the state taking an interest in the education of the common people. He wasn't talking about universal state schools like we have now, but about supporting basic education to combat the downsides of the division of labor. He worried that a worker doing the same tiny task all day long generally becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. Such a person, he warns, without the proper use of the intellectual faculties, is, if possible, more contemptible than even a coward. He believed the state benefits hugely from an educated population. They're less easily fooled by superstition or extremism, make better citizens, and respect the law more, ensuring stability. That foresight about the social impact of industrial work is pretty amazing for the 1770s. Hashtag the principles of taxation.
Okay, so governments have these necessary expenses. How do they pay for them? Smith lays out his famous 4 general maxims concerning taxation. They sound incredibly modern, really the foundation of good tax policy. 1, taxes should be proportional to ability to pay, based on revenue enjoyed under state protection. 2, they must be certain, not arbitrary. 3, convenient for the taxpayer to pay. And 4, they should be cheap to collect, taking as little extra out of people's pockets as possible. They seem like total common sense, right? But history's full of examples where they get ignored.
They are absolutely foundational, focused on fairness, predictability, and efficiency. Smith then goes through different kinds of taxes, measuring them against these principles. He hammers the main land tax in England because it was based on this really ancient valuation. Property values had changed massively since then, so it was altogether unequal. Some wealthy landowners paid relatively little, others more. Even worse in his eyes was the French taille. This was a direct tax mostly on peasants, often assessed arbitrarily by local officials based on what they thought someone could pay, not their actual income or land. This made it altogether arbitrary, and therefore altogether unequal and oppressive. It left taxpayers totally vulnerable to corrupt officials and discouraged any visible sign of prosperity.
Because it would just get taxed away.
Exactly. He also draws a line between taxes on necessaries, basic food, fuel, which tend to push up wages and therefore all prices, potentially hurting industry, versus taxes on luxuries, which don't usually have that broad inflationary effect. He points out reasonably that in a country where the winters are so cold as in Great Britain, fuel is a necessary of life. So heavy taxes on coal, for example, must increase some at the expense of the sober and industrious poor. Finally, he highlights just how expensive customs duties were to collect, with all the inspectors and paperwork. He estimates the salaries and perquisites ate up more than 20 or 30% of the actual revenue collected, way higher than for excise taxes. A huge administrative drag on public funds, showing the inefficiency of complex tariffs. Hashtag the burden of public debt.
And finally, we get to maybe the most unsettling topic Smith tackles here: public debt. He makes a direct link between want of parsimony in time of peace, governments not saving when times are good, and the necessity of contracting debt in time of war. And he is scathing about the ruinous expedient of perpetual funding, issuing government bonds that never get paid back, just pay interest forever. He notes that in Britain, any debt reduction during peacetime never bore any proportion to its accumulation in time of war. He sounds almost resigned, suggesting it's altogether chimerical to expect that the public debt should ever be completely discharged. That's a pretty bleak warning that echoes right down to today's fiscal debates.
It's incredibly prescient, isn't it? And it forces the question, what are the long-term effects of letting debt pile up like that? Smith saw that governments, especially during wars, faced huge, sudden costs they couldn't possibly cover with current taxes. Borrowing was tempting, almost necessary, but he viewed perpetual funding as fundamentally destructive. Why? He argued it basically mortgages the future. It diverts capital away from productive private investment into government hands. It shifts income from industrious proprietors, people who might otherwise use their capital to start businesses or improve land, to creditors of the public, bondholders who often have no such particular interest in the nation's actual productive assets. He worried this could lead to the neglect of land and the waste or removal of capital stock.
So debt sucks capital away from real growth?
That was his fear. He saw government debt as consuming future resources, draining national capital, and discouraging productive private investment. Instead of capital building factories, it's lent to the government, often just to pay for wars or ongoing expenses. He also touches on the really thorny issue of colonial taxation. He saw that the British Empire could be this huge internal free trade zone if customs laws were uniform. But the American colonies, having paid for their own relatively cheap local governments, absolutely refused to accept taxes imposed by the British Parliament from afar. They chose to draw the sword in defense of their own importance rather than pay taxes they hadn't consented to. He also notes governments often offer such good terms on debt that it tempts people to lend to the state instead of investing in riskier but potentially more beneficial private ventures. Smith's whole critique of public debt is just this powerful, enduring warning against unchecked government spending and the danger of burdening future generations. #outro.
Wow, what a journey that was. From pin factories and how work gets divided to the complex dance of capital, from watching feudalism crumble under the weight of urban desires to those sharp critiques of protectionism and the heavy warnings about public debt. This deep dive really shows that the core principles of economics, well, they seem pretty timeless, even if the world looks different now. It's a powerful reminder that these huge, complex systems often boil down to simple, observable human behaviors and incentives.
Indeed. Reading Smith really forces you to think critically about concepts we might take for granted: labor, value, the actual role of government. It's a constant reminder that economic policies, whether they sound good or are pushed by special interests, always have ripple effects, often unintended ones. And his championing of that obvious and simple system of natural liberty, it still resonates as a powerful path to prosperity, even if it's often overlooked. It encourages us to keep questioning, like he did, the interested sophistry, when private gain seems to clash with the general interests of the country, and to always think about the long game, especially with public finances.
So what stands out to you from this deep dive into the foundations of wealth? Which of these sort of timeless observations do you see still shaping our world? And maybe which ones have we forgotten, perhaps, at our own risk? How might Smith look at our economy today, dominated by services, through his lens of productive versus unproductive labor? Or what warnings might echo loudest about the sheer scale of global public debt we see now? Definitely something to think about. Let us know your thoughts. And thanks for joining us on the deep dive.